pleasure and honor to have you presenting with us today, Catherine. So I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, William. Hello, everyone. So sorry not to be able to be with you today in Granada, but glad to be here all the same. I want to thank the organizers, especially Amar and Tamsin, for inviting me to participate in this conference, and of course, the University of Granada. As you probably know, 5 minutes into my talk on Tuesday, there was a thunderstorm where I am, and everything shut down. As it is not quite the same to begin or to end a 3-day conference, please forgive me if I repeat things that have already been said. In my talk, I will be speaking from the viewpoint of culture, cultural tourism, and sustainability. Just to give you some background, I was since the start part of the great adventure of United Cities and Local Governments, otherwise known as UCLG, the largest world organization of local and regional governments, which has known a spectacular development since its beginning in 2004, placing local governments at the heart and sometimes in the forefront of some of the central debates of the last 2 decades, such as climate change, safe and resilient cities, multi-level governance and financing, culture and diplomacy, the right to the city, and so on. The members of UCLG are elected local government officials, mostly mayors, deputy mayors, regional presidents, who exchange their knowledge and experience and work together on new policies and practices for sustainable development. At the same time, UCLG intervenes in the global conversation around the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, as a strong advocate for the vital role of local governments in the implementation process of the SDGs, convinced that actions based on proximity contribute to solving major global challenges. Under the UCLG umbrella, the Culture Committee is similarly very active, both locally and globally. And as former Deputy Mayor of Culture in the French city of Lille, I joined the UCLG Culture Committee as soon as it came into existence in 2004. Culture Committee is dedicated, on the one hand, to the global dissemination of an Agenda 21 for culture, 21 for the 21st century, and how it can be put into practice locally in a very concrete way through policies and actions. For decades, culture was not a subject in the environmentalist world. But after years of advocacy, that has now changed, and culture has been widely accepted as the 4th pillar of sustainable development. Now, there are a lot of discussions about whether they should be pillars or circles or dimensions, whatever. We don't mind what is retained. What we want is to be right up there with the other main topics of sustainable development, so that we can think in terms of economic viability, social equity, environmental responsibility, and cultural vitality. And this obviously includes heritage and cultural tourism. Culture ultimately shapes what we mean by development and determines how people act in the world. We're all cultural beings, after all. Bringing together culture and local governments in integrated local area planning has led to the founding text, Agenda 21 for Culture, to a methodology including the seminal toolkit, Culture 21 Actions, and to 20 years of on-the-ground experimentation in new policies and practices. In our Pilot Cities program, we work with a city or region for 3 to 4 years before letting them go to carry on the good works as leading cities. Some of our key words, such as cultural diversity, social inclusion, cultural rights, public space, climate change, and eco-organization, are closely related to contemporary issues of tourism. The second focus of the Culture Committee is a global one, It is engaged to promote the crucial role of culture in the UN 2030 agenda, thanks to the collective effort of a unique collaboration between world cultural federations. ICOMOS, the International Council of Monuments and Sites, Culture Action Europe, the biggest European federation of cultural actors, IFLA, the International Federation of Library Associations, IMC, the International Music Council, Arterial, the largest African cultural network, the IFCD, the International Federation of Coalitions for Cultural Diversity, and UCLG Culture Committee. They represent all in all tens of thousands of cultural associations and NGOs. Together, we constitute quite an impressive cultural force to voice at the UN level our conviction that issues of culture, creativity, and heritage are vital for our global future. If I am spelling this all out in detail, it is because I would personally like to imagine a World Federation of Tourism stakeholders join the advocacy, as I am sure the future of sustainable culture and tourism is totally interdependent. The public sector has a central role in frameworking policies to foster cross-sector linkages. And we have for the past 2 decades been working with municipalities and regions on how to integrate cultural policies with most of the other local policies across the board, trying as much as possible to open up the silos of traditional municipal and regional policymaking. In 2014, the Culture Committee issued a document, Culture 21 Actions, as a toolkit focused on citizenship, culture, and sustainable development. It is based on 9 commitments and 100 questions. The 9 are heritage, diversity and creativity, culture and education, culture, equality and social inclusion, culture and environment, culture and economy, culture, urban planning and public space, cultural rights, cultural information and knowledge, and last but not least, the governance of culture, in a long-term effort to implement more horizontal, sustainable and participative policies and practice. You'll notice that there is no mention of culture and tourism. Yes, at the time, it was not an obvious priority for us. But in the past few years, with so many changes in cultural tourism, both positive and negative, with the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on both culture and tourism, and the ensuing transformations in the post-pandemic world, we are actively working on this issue with the same sustainable Agenda 21 for Culture outlook and methodology. It is clear that both cultural policies and tourism are changing in response to wider driving factors, and this is bringing culture and tourism closer together. Still, the relationship between cultural policy and tourism is extremely complex and multidimensional, and requires strong actions and integrated policy approaches with all the different stakeholders, public and private. Some cities have already moved in this direction, such as Copenhagen, with its policies positioning the local hoods of Copenhagen, a new strategy with its provocative title, The End of Tourism, based on a future, and I'm quoting, on a future of hosts and guests and the shared experience of localhood. I haven't had the opportunity to check the reality of the policy, but the very fact that it exists makes things move forward as it asks all the right questions. The present divide between insiders and outsiders, relatively mobile groups on one side and relatively sedentary ones on the other, is indeed a major challenge to cultural tourism. And there is a need to reframe the negative discourse of tourism into a more positive and proactive view of tourists, as Copenhagen is trying to do. The city of Barcelona, working closely on a joint program with UCLG, has been calling tourists temporary citizens for several years now, enabling them to become legitimate subjects of cultural policy, not just tourists for marketing purposes, so that local, regional, or national policymakers can tackle the question in a much more holistic way, a clearer starting point for those trying to implement sustainable development policies. Temporary citizens can then be considered as important actors on the urban scene, staying not just for leisure, but also for work, education, and personal development. In this sense, they should be taken into account, not just in quantitative, but also in qualitative terms. They often have a keen interest in local life and lifestyles, and many are spending extended periods living in urban communities. And in terms of mediation, there is a growing role for local temporary citizens interacting with tourists of their own culture, as well as for local residents themselves who can act as ambassadors and cultural facilitators. Whatever the approach, there is a need to gain support from the population as a whole, i.e. the need for participatory spaces and events with an overarching policy of cultural tourism governance. If not, the gaps emerging between residents and visitors and between residents in different parts of the same city will only widen. The relationship between cultural policies and tourism is also an issue of sustainability. In the current debates on over-tourism, much has been said about the sustainability of tourism. In fact, the issue is just as much one of cultural sustainability. Without the living culture of the city as the fourth pillar of sustainability, however great the heritage sites and cultural attractions, the quality of life of both permanent and temporary citizens will be negatively affected, and the attractiveness of the cities as lively places to visit, so important today, will decline. Of course, policies should not take into account just the preservation of culture and heritage. There also needs to be room for culture to develop and evolve and provide potential for future development as well. This is not a negligible subject, and the growing practice of placemaking shows that making room for both residents and visitors is extremely positive. For example, some cities like Lisbon are involving residents in decision-making over the use and management of central urban spaces, helping them to communicate and integrate the experience of visitors. And on the island of Jeju, to move far away from us, at least, in South Korea, there was a favored honeymoon island. Sorry, I'll start again. On the island of Jeju in South Korea, that was a favored honeymoon island for many decades by Chinese and Japanese tourists who came by the thousands to resorts and hotels especially built for them on the southern coastline. The Ole Trail, created almost single-handedly by a remarkable woman, Su Ming-suk, completely turned around the image of the island to become a renowned walking experience of nearly 450 kilometers, including trying the local hospitality and gastronomy, attending local cultural events on the trail, lessons in sustainability, and the revival of the local language. The pandemic, with all its negative sides for culture and tourism, nonetheless offers opportunity for reflection. Overcrowding, pressure on public services and infrastructure due to new forms of tourisms, I like to say tourisms, as well as the increase of center, periphery, and urban-rural divides are some of the impacts affecting cities and their resident citizens that should be addressed. many cities are now starting to think about their metropolitan area, away from the central municipality. Metropolitan thinking changes the relationship between center and periphery, extending the urban area and creating new centralities. But it also raises considerable challenges in terms of accessibility and resources. New strategies are developing cultural hubs in the periphery and encouraging greater cultural participation in areas where engagement has traditionally been low. In Lille, for example, in view of the European Capital of Culture in 2004, several closed factories in this post-industrial area were reclaimed and renamed the Maisons Folies, the madhouses, as part of an integrated approach to urban culture. 12 new buildings were transformed into innovative cultural spaces that were designed to be open, participative, and non-formal. At the time, this was original and daring because they were situated anywhere but in the center of Lille. They have become one of the most sought after cultural spaces of the region, attracting artists, residents, and tourists alike over a territory that extends as far as some of the frontier towns of Belgium. If each building is financed by the town on which it stands, the Lille metropole, 1.2 million inhabitants, in consultation with the artistic teams, has put in place a policy with financial incentives, ensuring that the artists will plan different phases of their creative work in several Maisons Folies, initiating new forms of creative exchanges for both residents and visitors, stimulating them to travel to new, more peripheral areas of the city. If the issues of culture and tourism in rural areas are quite different from those in city centers and urban sprawl, as one could expect, the development of culture-based tourism in small cities and rural areas relies even more heavily on innovative policies. As in the in-depth research program Creator, led by a team at the University of Coimbra in Portugal, showed, rural policies for cultural tourism do not necessarily require the physical development of new facilities, but more effective use of existing resources to meet the needs of residents and visitors. First introduced by Greg Richards, the concept of creative tourism has taken on a life of its own and become part of the culture and tourism vocabulary. Following the COVID-19 pandemic, creative tourism has the potential to attract travelers to places they might not otherwise visit, as they are primarily drawn to participate in workshops and learning activities. The small-scale nature of the creative offer, such as local gastronomy, arts and crafts, sustainable farming, and exploring specific aspects of biodiversity, is well suited to smaller areas, although creative tourism also takes place in different forms across metropolitan neighborhoods. The Occitanie region in the southwest of France encompasses the large cities of Toulouse and Montpellier, but is surrounded by a vast territory of small and very small rural towns and villages. The region has a strong proactive policy to bring about an adaptable rural tourism based on the discovery of its very diverse natural landscapes, its outstanding heritage sites spread over a large area, its remarkable historic rural architecture, as well as the specific lifestyles of its inhabitants. For this, it has initiated a new governance with all the other forms of local governments, and in France, it is many layered, as well as with the key stakeholders, to ensure that the policies are coherent with the local realities. The strategy is founded on 4 interconnected themes: sustainable tourism for the survival of tourism and the territory, social tourism because, I quote, everyone has a right to quality leisure, authentic tourism based on the specific characteristics and values of the region, and redistributive tourism to help maintain a social and economic balance in the region, a challenging issue in these very rural areas. Occitanie is also currently working on in an interesting partnership with the European programme through the participation of different civil society groups on gross local happiness indicators, not gross national, gross local, which it hopes, and I'm quoting, will enable to measure not just GDP, but to measure what counts, what makes people happy in our region. To conclude, we have worked in many cities, regions, islands even, on integrating urban planning and culture, economics and culture, health and culture, that we feel it is time to enter into a conversation, a new partnership with tourism. And although we are each irreplaceable, we are totally interdependent. I'm not saying that tourism isn't reflecting and acting as actively as we are. I know it does, because there is an urgency and absolute necessity for all professional sectors and decision makers to find sustainable answers and solutions to unmanageable development and impending climate change disasters if we don't. Well, what I am saying is that we cannot continue to work in our separate ways, even though it is clear that the relationship between culture and tourism is a complex one, involving many areas of planning, everyday life, and municipal, region, and national policies. Culture and tourism need to work together with a transversal vision of sustainable development, as well as develop new policies through governance processes that view culture, heritage, and tourism as a workable whole. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and welcome, Amar. So,
Hello, Amar.
So I'm going to hand over to Amar now, and if other folks too would like to ask a question or make a comment, as I mentioned before, I think most people will be viewing this as a recording in the asynchronous sessions, but I noticed there are a couple of other people there as well. So if you, other folks, if you'd like to speak, or you've got a comment you'd like to make or a question you'd like to make, just put it in the chat. But otherwise, I'm going to welcome Amar and hand over to him.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Catherine. Catherine, when I introduced you the other day, I was in Brisbane, Australia. And now I'm in Ahmedabad, India. And the one thing it shows is the post-pandemic transportation is back on deck. But also what's important is that airlines, are far more conscious of, the miles that you cover and the carbon imprint, and how they're trying to minimize. It's quite impressive. But you mentioned Copenhagen, and it's a very interesting example because I was living in Copenhagen for 4.5 years. And I used to attend the meetings by WOCO, as it's called, Wonderful Copenhagen, which is a monthly meeting of all the agencies dealing with tourism in Copenhagen. And the Danish Agency for Culture, in terms of its resourcing, in terms of its grants, in terms of the performances by artists and everything, connected very closely with the tourism networks and the local government, the Copenhagen City Administration. And then in some ways, it provides a model how cities, of course, Denmark is like 5 million people, and Copenhagen is not even, about not even 500,000 people. It's manageable. And but then you have the, situation of China, for example. which has taken a very distributed approach to tourism, sort of like Suzhou, Zhaozhou, the water cities and so on. And the UGLA has played such an important role. And I thought I might ask you a question. Do you remember in Rio 2012 when the MDGs were being reviewed, and UGLA played a very important role in advocating that in the future drafting of what is going to follow from MDGs to SDGs, the culture is situated. But at that time, UGLA was, and subsequently in 2015, focused on SDG level. But your presentation actually cuts right across all the 17 SDGs. And has UGLA taken a broader approach to SDGs, not just 11, but right across the 17? In my opinion, it has, because UGLA is such a diverse organization. And you have the insider information about the way UGLA's policies have evolved. And it's at the local government that impact of tourism needs to be sustained. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, the UCLG, as you say, has been working very, very hard on going across, really looking into all the SDGs and seeing how different topics such as culture actually exists, although they're not visible today, in all the 17 SDGs, and things to do with local governments. There is a huge work to show how the main preoccupations of local governments are very present in all the SDGs. And there is a big advocacy on the part of the UCLG is I don't know how many local governments, provinces, regions, cities. We know today that more than half, nearly half the world population lives in urban conditions. So it represents a lot of people and a lot of experiences, and it's still trying to get across to the UN, the nations, the importance of tapping in to the experience of local governments. But it's very, very active, Amar. And, we are now working very hard on the 2030 agenda, trying to get in as much as we can on local experience.
Thanks, Catherine. I don't know if Tamsin, are you collecting questions?
Yes, just if people want to unmute themselves and ask a question, they can go ahead and do that.
Now, while you're collecting the question, Tamsin, Catherine, I have one more question to ask. UCLG, UCLA, sorry, I always get those things mixed up.
UCLG.
Yeah, UCLG. And in terms of statistics, I mean, we get World Tourism Organization, for example, has the global statistics and the trends and everything. But to me, UCLG is the one that looks at the aggregates at the local level, local government level. The real benefits in terms of the 4 pillars that you mentioned are at the local government level. And do you think that World Tourism Organization, which collects the statistics, disaggregates to assist in policy development at the local government level?
Sorry, I didn't hear.
I sometimes wonder if the statistics provided by UNWTO, to what extent they assist in policy development at the local government level. Or is it, I mean, if you take Vietnam, for example, Vietnamese, everybody collects statistics. I've never come across a country where the national statistics, provincial statistics, local government statistics. But the statistics are very critical at the local government level in Vietnam to make sure that, job creation, poverty alleviation, women's empowerment are addressed. And whereas UNWTO, in terms of desegregating the statistics, I think sometimes it could improve its statistical collection so that it would assist in policy development, the way you talked about it. You want to comment on that?
Well, I mean, I'm pretty convinced about what you say for local governments, and I think that's why we're trying to attract attention to work, because you have to be able to answer about statistics, world statistics, etc. And we're trying to, in a way, be the mirror image of what we consider to be a reality. I mean, we are the closest things to people, to what they really do, to how they think, to how they act. And we often have the feeling that this is not taken into account enough.
And do you want to, you haven't mentioned about the UCLG awards. I mean, you have this fantastic way of inviting nominations, going through a rigorous process and doing due diligence in the way you recognize and award outstanding performers. I mean, could you comment on that, please?
Sure. I mean, it's what we call the Mexico Prize for the most outstanding city from the cultural and sustainable point of view every 2 years. And what is amazing is that, I think we're on our 5th edition or something like that. We started off with 30 cities from all over the world being candidates. And now we're in the hundreds. And what is incredible is that there are a lot of them that we've never heard of in our network, that we don't even know what work they do. And thanks to this prize, because they send in their candidacy documents, we learn of what they're doing, which may not be, Agenda 21 for culture, but we've never minded about that. If people are doing things that goes towards bringing more sustainability in the cultural world, let's say, we take it on board. We think that's fantastic. And it enables us to enrich our knowledge of what is going on in the cultural, in local governments, in cities and regions, in the cultural world. So it's, as you were sort of saying, Amma, it's not so much the prize as everything we learn about what's going on every 2 years.
Fantastic. I mean, I think it's, I'm a great fan, as you can tell, bro, of UCLG. I've participated in your meetings, especially the one in Barcelona and also Stockholm and so on. Tamsin, have you got any questions?